Before we dive into this episode, I want to take a second to speak about our sponsor, Pith & Stem, who we are thrilled to have on this journey with us. As someone who is always looking for ways to improve my healthy hustle, Pith & Stem's drop-top desk stood out to me as the best full work-from-home solution on the market. The world of work from home is changing, and a laptop or screen perched on your lap or dining room table isn't enough anymore. It's imperative that we have a solution at home that matches our productivity station that we can have in our office. But of course, homes weren't made to be worked in, and not all of us want a dedicated study. That's why I'm so happy that Pith & Stem created this perfect solution. They designed this desk with both the needs of the professional and their home in mind. It's perfect because it allows me to have a full productivity station that suits my needs and helps me get the most out of every minute that I spend at it, not only so I work comfortably, but that I actually enjoy it. And the best thing about Drop Top, I can close and lock it at the end of the day to keep work and home separate. And it looks awesome on the wall. You can get your Drop Top desk anywhere in the world from pithandstem.com or just Google Drop Top and you'll find it pretty quickly.
Thank you so much for listening and watching these episodes. It feels like you're really part of the journey with us. And can I ask you one favor to help us grow even further? You may have noticed that we've been getting some amazing guests on. We've got more listeners than ever. But you can help us continue to give value to you by clicking that subscribe or follow button below. It helps us to show everyone else how well we're doing and therefore give you more value by getting bigger guests and take the podcast on the road. It takes you 2 seconds and it's completely free and it helps us more than you know. Thank you.
You had money in the bank and you built a really successful business. But at what point did you think, I'm not going to put the money into a Ferrari and instead I'll put it into a charity?
You're meant to buy the Ferrari. That's what you're meant to do. That's what entrepreneurs learn, especially in Dubai, right? You're surrounded by entrepreneurs who work incredibly hard. They get to a certain point where they, got enough success to be able to pour that into something which feels like a reward for all the hard work they've done. And for a lot of entrepreneurs, they feel like that's the thing that's going to make them happy. But really, the light bulb moment I had was that it's a status symbol that really is just to impress other people. And I think that when I look back and think about why that was the case, for me personally, I remember in COVID, I remember losing everything in COVID, right? 2020, lockdowns, lost the business in the UK, lost the business in UAE, had to basically start from scratch. And that was only 5 years ago. And during that time, we had a massive freelance team in the Philippines. And they went through this huge crisis with, flooding and all sorts. And myself and a good friend of mine, Jason, who's been on your podcast as well, we managed to raise enough money within 24 hours to feed 25,000 people who were basically stuck. And in that same week, we launched a new business about 5 days earlier, and I made £25,000 that week on this new business, right? So I basically created, and that was through monthly recurring revenue, a 6-figure business that week. And that gave me an amazing buzz. And at the same time, we managed to feed 25,000 people completely stuck and abandoned. And I got a bigger buzz from that. And the feeling that I got from saving people and looking after people and basically philanthropy was 10 times what I felt from the financial goal. And I realized then that, if you really want to experience maximum fulfillment from your business, then it's not just about chasing status, it's about chasing impact. And so for me, that was a massive light bulb moment.
And was there ever any guilt of spending or perhaps not spending on other people?
Not spending on other people as in through a charity. I don't think there's anything wrong with owning expensive things that you value and you feel like you should reward yourself with. I just think that you're missing out on an awful lot if you don't actually give back. I think a lot of people do feel a sense of guilt if they don't. I think people feel separated from the reality of what's going on there. And it's really easy to, live your life and feel sheltered from it and not visit the places where people live a completely different life to you. Yeah. And I think once you see that, you might experience what I did, which is this point of no return.
Yeah. Well, just talk me through that feeling when you fed those people, those 25,000 people, and you were sat presumably in Dubai. What was that feeling like when you were seeing them being fed? You were probably seeing the thanks coming through, and you and Jason were able to talk about the impact you'd had.
I just remember thinking, this is the point. Like, this is it. I just a part of me just catapulted myself 20 years later, and I could look back at my life in 20 years and be like, amazing success with business, financially smashed all the targets, revenue through the roof, really great, successful commercial enterprise. and no giving back, no impact beyond the impact we're making naturally through the program we've got, right? Or it was a case of I could look back and say, yes, we built something incredibly successful commercially, but at the same time, I managed to maximize my fulfillment selfishly within the business by having these philanthropic ventures and also change lives on the way. I think that's, also being a dad. It's an element of legacy there. And legacy for me isn't really what you give kids. It's not like, I look at my 3 kids and I'm like, what am I going to leave them behind? I don't think of legacy like that at all. I think the greatest thing I can leave my children is stories and it's education. It's what I leave inside them, not physically with them. And I think growing up in a house like we've got, where we balance entrepreneurship with philanthropy, is this kind of amazing experience for them, where they've got these stories and these experiences of both sides. So for me, I think that drives me a lot, knowing that I'm raising my kids to see the world in a different way, to look through life through a different lens,
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is that in our first podcast together, we touched on a lot of this. You just had your second child, you're now on to 3.
Yep.
And we spoke a lot about your background and your journey and your experience up to building the Warrior Academy, which is your martial arts organization. I think one of the largest independent in the world as we sit here in 2025.
We're top 3. I think we teach about 6,000 children every single week. There are big martial arts franchises out there, but very few independent youth martial arts organizations as big as us now. So
exactly. And so what's interesting to me is we spoke about the success of the business. In this conversation, we're going to talk much more about the charity side. But what would Seb 15 years ago have done when you're at the start of that journey? You're just starting the business. Maybe you're a couple of years in, probably not actually, just a few years, maybe a few months in. How do you change the way that you look at business now compared to then in the terms of you might have been more driven to buy a Ferrari back then than you are now? And so what would that person say? That person 15 years ago, that version of you, how did that change? But what would that person have wanted?
I think it's really difficult. If we're being completely frank here, it's really difficult to think about feeding other kids if you don't feel fed yourself, right?
Yeah.
If your cup's not full. And I think that one of the beautiful things about growing a business is once you solve the problem of personal finances and being able to cover most things in your life that you need, you then have this feeling of where do we go from here? And a lot of people go down the road then of building charities or doing more philanthropy. But for me, that all started before we were massively successful within our industry or whatever. It was a case of what can we do now? And so that's exactly what we did, right? The whole concept of a scholarship actually started when we weren't financially successful.
Okay. So how did that mindset change, or who influenced that mindset change?
I remember being really inspired by B1G1.
Okay.
And, for a long time, we tied every single transaction within our business to a donation. And so, we were giving 365 days of life-saving clean water to families in Africa, education in India, bicycles to kids in Cambodia, all this sort of stuff as a automatic donation every time a customer bought a certain thing or signed up to a yearly membership or whatever it was. The feeling for me changed when I realized I felt a bit distant to those donations. It didn't feel like I was connected to it. And so I think it was the question I asked myself, which was, can we build this into our own program so that actually it feels more real for me, for the team, for the customers, and we feel more in touch with it all.
I'm still interested in the part of when you were younger and because you had a success from a young age, right, with the business. At what point were you ever interested in the material side? At what point did you go, I want to try a car, I want to travel? Obviously, we've been through your base jumping, your extreme sports, where the business just funded this adventurous life. And then there was a change where you went, I must help more people, which is clear from sort of, I think, maybe 2017 onwards. But do you remember that happening and what was going on in your life at that time?
Yeah, so I was doing a business accelerator with Dan Priestley and Dent, and I sat down at a table and had to come up with this concept of what our big game was in the world, right? So when you look at how you structure a pitch, it's what we were taught was name, same, fame, goal, game. Game is, what is the impact you want to make on the world? What do you want to be known for? Why does your business exist for a reason beyond just making money? And I remember sitting down at a table and thinking, I better come up with something really impressive. And there were 200 or 300 other business owners in the room, and I felt like I was way out of my league, right? I was, 27, and all these people had, made hundreds of thousands of pounds every year. We were probably maybe 300,000 pounds in with a team of 5 or so, and I was making just enough to kind of have a decent enough income myself. The game that I wrote down was that I wanted to inspire a generation to make a global impact and effectively sponsor 10,000 vulnerable kids in developing countries around the world. And we wanted to do that within 10 years. So I stood up, wrote it down on a piece of paper, stood up this scruffy bit of paper and explained it to the whole crowd. And it obviously sounded very impressive. But I remember sitting back down with that piece of paper thinking, I've actually got to figure out how to do this now. and I had no idea how to do it. Even paying for 1,000 kids to go through this membership, the program we've got, I couldn't. There's no way that even the profits we were making in the business could actually cover that, let alone 10,000. So we very much tied the impact and the philanthropy side of what we're doing to the commercial success of the business. So in order to achieve that impact goal, I had to grow the business commercially.
And what's interesting there is that the first podcast we did together, that I've already alluded to, I think was 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, and you had just started your charity, the Bates Foundation. And what's so fundamental there is that nothing's changed in the way you're speaking about it. It's still about helping people and using the enterprise value of the business, the cash that's been generated from the business, to support people and help others do a similar thing. And so this podcast, this second episode together, has really come around because we've just got back from a week in Kenya, where you took 20 patrons who were people who are paying into the charity to get boots on the ground in Nairobi, or Africa's largest slums. We visited 5 schools around Nairobi, and we saw thousands of children and just the impact that's being made. But I'm interested in asking you, what at this stage of the charity, specifically on this trip, with people who are paying and have done for a couple of years to help these kids, which part of that trip emotionally struck you the most?
I think that the first thing for me was the scale of the poverty. I've been to a lot of slums around the world. India, I've spent weeks in the slums of India, some remote areas in Nepal, orphanages, rescue centers all over the world, favelas of Rio, loads in Southeast Asia. The biggest thing for me was how much of a crisis these kids were in, and how vast the problems were, how systemic the issues were, right? A couple of things really spring to mind. So the first thing is, within our first week there, we realized that we wanted to launch a food program. So what we prepared was to give out 500 meals to a rescue center in the middle of a slum. And the reason we needed to do that is because these kids were only getting 1 meal a day. When we were giving out these meals, and we had all the patrons lining up, giving out all the meals in these massive blue buckets full of rice or beans or whatever it was, right? And I noticed some kids in the queue had lunch boxes. And the reality was, the kids with lunch boxes were quite cleverly taking the food, putting a lid on top, and taking it home to share with their family. These kids were suffering from malnutrition. They were suffering from poor water quality. They borrowed a school uniform but gave it back at the end of the day. And this meal was there for the whole family, not just them. And you could spot them because they'd put the lunchbox, they put the lid on top and then run away with it. And Monica, our local operations manager from Kenya, who grew up in the area, was like, these are the kids who are taking it home to their parents to share it. And so what that meant was, they were going, sometimes several days without food. In the evenings, they would beg for food. So for me, it was how devastating the impact of a lack of food was for these kids. I sat down with one boy, and he explained to me, look, he kind of broke down in front of me, and he was about 9 years old. And he goes to me, and the hardest thing that I've got to deal with is the anxiety. And I thought, what's the anxiety for? And he said he's basically crippled by this anxiety of he doesn't know when he's going to eat next. And I remember not having any answers for him, and just sitting there, and he was just explaining to me that, often when he's not in school during the weekends, there's just no food. He'll go begging and he won't get enough money or food to actually eat. So he spends the entire week worried about not eating at the weekend because they go to school, they get one meal. At the weekend, they get nothing. And you can see the malnutrition in these kids, right? Especially their upper arms are slightly skinnier than they should be. And there are certain physical signs of malnutrition which become really obvious. Once you know how to spot it, you can't unspot it. And so the reality with this boy was he was suffering with crippling anxiety. You know, what's he going to do with his family, with food? He feels a sense of responsibility to look after his younger siblings. They're going hungry as well. He said to me that he used to sniff glue in order to numb the physical pain of not being able to eat. And I asked him, does he still sniff glue to do that, to avoid the pain? And he says since he started martial arts, he's stopped doing that. And I found that really interesting. You know, I asked him, why has martial arts been the reason, you know, you're not sniffing glue anymore? And he says, basically, the program we've given him with the martial arts training has taught him how to control his mind. He says he's got something every day he looks forward to. He looks forward to the training, and he wants to be in the best position to do the training. He looks up to his black belt mentor. He wants to copy them and live like them. And so there's a really interesting piece here with emotional regulation. You know, we teach these kids, you know, how to stand, how to sit, how to meditate, how to exert themselves, how to control their mind, all this sort of stuff. And we push them physically, but as a result of that, they learn how to regulate their own emotions. And he said to me, look, I don't get anxious anymore. Even though I'm still hungry, I don't get anxious anymore because I'm able to calm myself down. Instead of getting scared that I'm not getting any food, I meditate. And he actually uses a technique we've been using with, you know, kids in the UK and UAE. He's sitting down in the slums meditating to fight off the pain of hunger. And I just thought it's mind-blowing, right? That the effect of our program really hits on a very practical level. Like what is the actual physical pain they get and the psychological pain they get, and how does our program help them? So that for me was a massive indicator that our program does the right thing. As a result of that, we committed to giving these kids food every single time before they trained. And then what I realized when I spoke to Monica, our local operations manager, I realized that this wasn't isolated just this one place. We've got other clubs where kids, they look smart because they're in school uniforms, but they give them back and they go and live on the slums. And so what I realized is I had built a martial arts academy in Kenya with 3,000 kids who were super competitive, who wanted to become black belts, who were turning up for training, but they were starving. So these kids didn't have any food. They were turning up, training anyway. And, you know, I then noticed the instructors were using their own money to buy electrolytes, and all these issues came fundamentally because they were starving. And so I kind of made the decision then and there, you know, just like I did that day when I wrote down a piece of paper, this is what we're going to do, that you know, no kids will come to class hungry. We committed to feed 3,000 kids every single week, which is, you know, a huge amount of food that we're now giving out. And we rolled that out across the whole of Kenya. You know, I remember sitting down with the patrons and saying to them, look, I'm going to do this. I'm signing up to this. This is the point of no return for me, part 2, right? I'm doing it again. And I remember thinking, I hope they join me for this ride. And I looked up to the group and I was like, you know, who's with me? And everyone was up for it.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly. And what I think, there's so much to unpack from that, but I think the first thing we need to talk about is I've been involved in the charity since its inception. And watching it from afar, watching you go out with, you know, with Peter to go and suss out these places, build relationships and speak to these people has been one thing. But to be on the ground, I don't think people realize just how bad it is. I don't think they realize, you know, you're talking about slums, and the word slum, people don't understand. They just think it means tough area to live. Maybe it's going to be, you know, maybe it's going to look a bit different. But these are mud huts, 2 meters by 2 meters, pitch black. I'm 6'2". I couldn't stand up straight in there. There's 4 people living in there. You know, they've got goats' heads hanging from the ceiling because that's their one possession they want to show off. This is their food for the month, perhaps. And you walk out and there's raw sewage going down the street. We couldn't even have a guide take us from one side of the slum to the other with the same, to go to visit a different school, because there's gang warfare where they won't allow you to go from one side to the other. And so for me, the impact was not only seeing what's being done for the kids, it's seeing the reality of what they're living with. And that's the part that changed for me. I said to you before, I just want every single person in that charity, but that all of us come into contact with, to win so hard, because we don't realize what we've got, do we? Like,
no. And I think, you know, the reality of the living conditions is that it's so poor, right? But then what comes from that is the reality of complete desperation.
Yeah.
When humans are desperate, it's the breeding ground of trauma. So what you've got is you've got all these working age men, right? 20 to 50, and they just want to provide for their families. And they can't. They go home every day after trying to sell something on the streets or beg or whatever it is to try and, make enough money to feed the family. And they go home and they have to explain to their kids they can't feed them. They go home and their wives are trying to breastfeed, but they can't produce enough milk because they're starving. They go home and they've got to send their kids to bed even though their stomachs are in pain. This is the reality for those dads, right? And, of course, mums face exactly the same challenges. But I'm thinking, what's it like for me to go home and say to my family of 3 kids, 1 baby, and my wife, and say, I can't give you any food. Everyone's going to bed hungry. And so a lot of these dads turn to alcohol or glue to numb the pain. And so alcoholism is a massive issue. And then from that comes all the toxic things that evolve from that, right? You've got the domestic violence. You've got the abuse at home. And the stories are tragic. There was one case when Charlie, our instructor, was sat down with one child, and he just wouldn't leave his side for about 4 hours in one of the orphanages in Nakuru. And Charlie's got tattoos on his arm, and towards the end, the boy looked at Charlie and said, "You're just like me." And Charlie was thinking, is this is about martial arts? Yeah, but I'm exactly the same as you. Yeah. And he goes, "No, your tattoos on your arm." And then the boy was like, he pulled up his shirt, and there were just lines of tattoos on his stomach. This is a 6-year-old boy where he's just been abused with a tattoo gun. And you wonder what, yes, the environment is devastating, but the actual trauma that goes on, which no one even understands or sees or talks about, that is life-changing, and it's also generational. And so when you've got that, this generation then grows up, and then that trauma passes on to the next generation, and so on. So it's one thing understanding the huge crisis with food and accommodation and sewage and all this sort of stuff, but then it's understanding the widespread trauma as a result of that. And I suppose that really hit me hard. The how dads must feel not being able to provide for their kids.
Yeah, absolutely. It was horrendous in many ways. When you're looking at these kids, and we've just explained the scenarios they're living in, but they're there, and then, at some of these schools, we're seeing 1,000 kids in a small clearing in a slum in pristine white uniforms that they've been given by the Bates Foundation, and they're training and they're doing special kicks that I don't know what they're called, swinging kicks.
I'm sure we got some B-roll of him doing some decent kicks. Actually,
I can do some kicks. Yeah, and they're barefoot and they are smiling and they've got almost nothing, but they're in these pristine uniforms. So, what does martial arts mean to them rather than give them? What does it mean to them in this scenario?
Martial arts is purpose and identity. Martial arts is almost like the ability to look into the future. One of the hardest things when a child is starving and they are surrounded by devastation, abuse, lack of food, all this serious stuff, is that it's really hard for them to look into the future. And that's where anxiety comes from, right? So whenever they try to look into the future, it's devastating and that gives them anxiety. So what martial arts does is it provides them with direction. It provides them with purpose. When you give a child a martial arts uniform, it's not just giving them a piece of clothing. And you saw this, right? When you gave that child a uniform, when you tied on their belt, you would have seen in their eyes like a change. They would have lit up. And in that moment, they're not just a child with an extra spare bit of clothes, even though it might be their only second pair of clothes. That is a child who then feels like they're a martial artist. And so they look at their black belt instructor, who's escaped the slums, because we always hire local instructors, and they say, how do I do that? And so now they're on a 6 to 8 year journey where it changes their life. And so for a child, it's purpose and it's identity. Now they look at the decisions they make, and it's, do I want to sniff glue? Do I want to hang out in gangs? Do I want to commit crimes? Do I want to steal? Or do I want to be like a martial artist and listen to the instructor? And so I think that's the beautiful thing about martial arts. You've got all these incredible sports. You give these kids a football, they'll kick it around, right? But when you give these children a uniform and you give them structure like that, it's really an identity shift. And for a lot of these kids, they actually do get an opportunity. They get an opportunity to go into education, right? For a lot of the homeless kids that we rehabilitate from the streets of Nairobi and into a homeless shelter, then into full-time education, they get their shot. The one thing that derails that is the decisions they make. And the decisions they make are based on their character. And so what we do is we come in, we develop their character, we give them a hand up, not a hand out. And then what we do is we help them make the right decisions. So when the gangs come in to try and get them to do, commit crimes for them. When child labor comes in and they try and they work early doing something else, right? Or when they're encouraged to steal food or whatever it is, which then leads them down a dark path, whether it's addiction or homelessness or whatever it is, right? They then base their decisions based on their character, which has evolved through the program. And so for me, it's one of the most profound and unlikely solutions for kids in the slums. And it's a huge part of it. But there are several game changers, I would call them, where I've really thought there's more we can do to create this completely revolutionary, holistic process to help a child in a slum.
I think game changer is a really good way to explain it, because on the last day I was lucky enough to play football with loads of these kids and embarrassingly missed 2 open goals, but no one got that on camera, which is fine, which they thought was very funny. But we had fun. We had a great game. It's a universal language, football. But the guidance and the mentorship, and you could see the difference in them when they were doing martial arts. They loved it so much. And there's a quote in your book, the Not a Victim book, and it says, "A child with no identity is vulnerable to the identity others place on them," which I thought was such a good quote for what you're doing right now. Yeah. And do you think that hits differently when you see the children in Kenya, for example, in person? That quote.
Pause. Sorry, it's me, Freddie, interrupting myself. I just want to point out how well this guest is doing at building trust with you, the audience. They're adding value, they're giving inspiration, and they're hopefully educating you on a few different areas. You see, we're in a trust recession, and becoming a podcast guest is literally the best way to continue to build trust while so many are struggling. We've built a community of incredible entrepreneurs, all becoming the top most in-demand podcast guests in the world. And if you click some of our links below, not only have we got templates to help you become a top guest, we've also got a community that you can join to get yourself to where you want to be. Now back to the episode.
I think that identity becomes a huge driving force for everything a child does, right? If you look at what we do in the UAE, we want to develop a child's confidence and identity before they get a phone. As soon as you give a child a phone, it's the online environment that dictates what their identity is. Yeah. Now, with the slum kids, if we're able to help develop their character and give them this martial arts identity before they fall victim to gangs or get to addiction, then it makes such a difference. So it's getting in there and planting those seeds way before they have to make the decision. I just think that it's from the UAE and the UK side, where we're trying to develop the identity of kids before they go online, we're saving their mental health. When we're doing it in the slums of Kenya, we're saving their lives.
Yeah.
Like we're taking the non-victim system, we're taking the Warrior Academy system, the Warrior method, and we're taking it to some of the most devastating places on the planet, where kids are the most vulnerable that exist on Earth, and we're doing exactly the same things, but the stakes are higher. We're literally saving lives doing it.
Yeah, exactly. There's a couple of bits that really stick with me from that trip, and I want to hone in on the area that there was 15 to 20 patrons there. These people who are supporting the charity, they've on their own expense come out and given as much as they can to not only to the kids but also to raise awareness and exposure. And on one of the days, we were playing, I think it was at Kirigu school, we were playing with the kids, and some of them were doing, roundhouse kicks and trying to take me down. And we're having fun in the moment. And then I found myself replying to a text on my phone. And that contrast just hit me. And almost every evening we'd have these massively reflective dinners where it was almost a somber experience, because the word for the week became excitement because of the excitement of what we can do in the future. But every day you couldn't help but just think about what you'd seen and the impact these small things are happening on these kids are having. And so I wonder, you touched on the UAE there and obviously the UK in your past. How do you live with the contrast? And some of the stuff you said to the patrons, if you could just explain now, you spoke about how you live with the idea that we think that we are just giving, and that's a good thing, but actually it's deeper than that.
Yeah, I think that, I took 15 to 20 entrepreneurs who donate to the Bates Foundation to the biggest slum in Africa. And It was sombering. It was shocking. It was emotional. It was life-changing. For a lot of them, it shook them to their core. Emotionally, they had never experienced anything like that. Part of that is the contrast to their own lives, right? So I felt an element of responsibility in that I'd taken these great people and thrown them right in the deep end of this is what's out there in the world. But that was the promise of the trip, right? That was the promise of the charity. You know, a 3-year life-changing journey where, you know, you change the way you look at the world and your place within it. And it's this fusion of impact and adventure for them. And so that's what we did. But I remember that night, you know, we had gone to a homeless shelter in Nairobi that had saved kids from the slums and addiction 2 months before, 1 month before. We had gone to 2 slum schools that day where they are rescue centers for kids, you know, where these kids are living in devastating conditions through slums, and we need armed security to take us from one side to the other side. So with going to those 3, you know, we had a shocking experience. And I remember sitting down at that table and just the mood was flat, right? Everyone was just like trying to process it, and processing it became the big word. And I remember explaining to the patrons, look, I've been there and felt this so many times, and in some ways I'd like to say it gets easier, but there are new things that shock me all the time. There are so many things that I wouldn't do, and I would say don't do if you're trying to process this. You know, just like you said, looking at your phone, right? I remember being in the Dharavi slums, the biggest slum in Asia, in India. And I remember sitting down with 2 kids. One of them was suffering from polio, so could barely walk. And I'm chatting to them and giving them some water and sweets or whatever, and trying to make the moment quite light, because why wouldn't it be light? It's only me that would make it negative, right? And because of the contrast. But then out comes my phone, I get a notification. Vicky sent me some videos of the kids, and they're playing in Dubai, just being kids over here. And I've got kids, same age as my kids, 3 of them, suffering with polio, haven't eaten, and in torn clothes with no shoes on. And I've got my kids playing at home. I'm literally looking at my phone, looking at the kids, looking at my phone, thinking, this is totally unfair. It's heartbreaking when you look at the contrast. And the only reason is because they were born in the right place at the right time, right? That is the only thing that separates us. And so you could look at yourself and what you're doing, and you could say, this is devastating, this is so sad. I feel guilt, I feel shame about all this sort of stuff, right? But my perspective has changed over the years. And, you know, I think that on one hand, you could feel that guilt and shame, or you could go home and do something about it. And so one of the things that I said to the patrons, you know, we're all there, a group of Westerners in the slums, taking photos of the kids, trying to tell the story of what these kids are going through, you know, and being like, here we are, this is the impact we're making, we're giving out food, we're giving out uniforms. But you've got to be really careful that this is not something that just benefits you, beyond the I've given the kids something. The gift that the kids give those who visit is perspective. And so one of the things that I don't really like about charities visiting these locations is they go home and they say, you know what, I've had this amazing perspective and it's really just made me feel so grateful for everything in my life. And that's all great. But unless you take action, it's actually quite selfish. So my point of view around all of that, and what I tried to explain to the patients, was perspective is useless or even selfish without implementation. And so everyone left Kenya with this purpose energy, right? It was infectious. It was like you could speak to someone who had been there and they just had this extra energy in everything they did, which would impact their family life, impact their business, impact how the Bates Foundation grows. And what I said to them is, don't waste the energy. So they've all got mixed emotions, right? The best way to deal with that is to channel those emotions. I think one of the things that is good for the charity, but probably quite bad for me, is how I deal with it. And in the moment, when I see horrific things, I go straight into action mode. I'm like, right, I need to solve this straight away, you know? And I remember that time I was in St. Martin's rescue centre, and we just we just given out uniforms to the kids, and the head teachers wanted to speak to me, so I sat down with 3 of the head teachers, and they were sitting to me, you know, explaining, thank you so much for the program, what we're doing for the kids, the uniforms, and they said, look, you know, some of the kids here are starving, and I said, look, just going to stop you there. Do you need a food program? And they were like, yes. Monica, can we give them a food program? She was like, yeah, we can make it work. I was like, cool. let's get them a food program. And so I stood up and they were all, they couldn't believe that the decision was made that quickly. And so the way I do business is very much like that. Okay, idea to concept implementation. For them, they probably used to working with some charities or whatever, and nothing ever gets done. People talk about it. And so, it's, for me, I process those difficult things by having immediate action.
Yeah.
But it's also important to take time and just reflect on the emotions you're feeling. Otherwise, it's easy just to cast them under the rug and you feel it later.
But also the difference between most charities and with the Bates Foundation is that you can actually see, or we could all see, and now everyone who's in our circles can now see where the money is being spent. Because a lot of the patrons were asking, well, can we just give more money? Or people are in the wider sphere just say, can we give more money? And the point is that most charities don't have that transparency. Whereas we've been there, and the impact came from us seeing that if you give $10 gets spent.
Yeah.
So I guess the question would be, how do you build that trust with people on the ground in Kenya to make sure that it's literally going to the people that need it most?
You ask, you don't guess. So this is the biggest realization of growing a charity.
It's like a startup.
And yeah, it's exactly a startup, right? And this is what I was trying to say to the group, the patrons that we brought over. I was like, this is a raw but real insight into how to start a business in a developing country. It's a charity. We're giving everything away, but it's the same feeling. And as an entrepreneur, you use the same skills to build a business as you do building a charity. And if you do that, the charity is very successful, right? But one of those fundamentals are that you ask and you don't guess. And so here's a great way of explaining that. I was sat with an orphan in the crew, 9-year-old girl, and she was talking to me. I was asking her, what's the hardest thing about your day? And she thought for a second and she said, it's the cold. And I thought, the cold? It's hot in Kenya, isn't it? But I hadn't got up at 5 a.m. and walked for 90 minutes outside. It was under 10 degrees. She's only wearing a t-shirt and shorts to get to school. It's freezing, right? And she hasn't got enough money to have warm clothes. So the hardest thing for her was getting to school. So you might think, as a charity, right, let's put all of our money into get warm clothes. That's the hardest thing, right? But in your haste of doing that, you then don't realize that she's suffering with malnutrition. You haven't noticed the physical signs of malnutrition with her. But when you do, you might think, okay, she can deal with being uncomfortable in the morning, but she needs food in order to function and live, right? And so you go through the stage where you're like, right, well, let's just put all of our money into food. And now the situation is, well, in your haste doing that, you've missed out on the fact that she doesn't get enough water. The water quality is really poor. Okay, let's put our money into that. But in doing that, you haven't realized that the only reason she gets food is because she goes to school. And she only goes to school because right now her parents can afford the $1 a month to get her together. Or in her case, the guardians could afford the $1 a month, right? And so, within 2 months, they're going to run out of money. She won't be able to go to school, which means she doesn't get that water access. She doesn't get that food access. So you might think, let's cover the school budget. But now you're paying all your money towards that. The ecosystem of issues just carries on. And so the next thing could be, well, now we can't afford to put the money into the martial arts program, which for me is one of the biggest things, because our instructors aren't just teaching martial arts, they're social care workers. They can spot, because they have a different role to teachers and it's very personal, they can spot the issues that kids often have. And so they have spotted kids going through domestic violence at home before the teachers have. So now, because you're putting all your money on the school, you're now forgetting that we've got this incredible holistic self-development program which prevents abuse at home. And so she might go to school now, but then she goes home and gets abused by a distant relative or another person in her life, right? And so the reality that I realized was you have to find out what these issues are. You can't just go in thinking, oh, I know what to do. I'm going to give them food, and that's it. And so that's why we work with locals. We've got an incredible local team. Monica, head of operations, she then says, here is the hierarchy of issues. My job, and probably one of the hardest jobs, is I've got to say no to things that they really need. I've got to say no to the things that I know would change their life in order to give them the things that we feel, based on speaking to the locals, would actually help them the most. And, I think running a charity, you need a big heart, but you need thick skin.
Yeah.
And, the way that we then do that is we focus on specific things like the martial arts program, the character development program, and the food program, which we're covering as well. And then we look for partners, right? So period kits for preteen girls who haven't got a clue what's about to hit them when they start having their period. And it's one of the biggest reasons they don't go to school. Huge hygiene risk. Then you've got the hydration sachets, which we partner with. So now we're fitting all these partnerships in to what we're doing. And we've got 7 of them, which we're calling the 7 game changers, which we can then take as a product to a slum and say, there is a product which we know would really help benefit the kids there. And that's actually a scalable product, right? So this is a business mindset into a charity. You're looking at that ecosystem of problems you can solve for someone, and you are creating a core product which is scalable.
This is the part that I think is really interesting, and it's fun to watch the crossover between business, startup, and charity, because one of the biggest issues I think non-profits usually face is charity fatigue, because as you say, there's an endless list of things you could help them in so many ways.
Yeah.
And people just over time they stop giving because they're like, I've given my dues for a few years. I've had some impact. What more do you want from me? It's the same with things like Comet Relief that gave billions over years, and you want to keep going, but they end up just feeling like, well, who's helping me? And the sort of mindset changes. And to your point there's so many things you can do, but you need to prioritize them. So how would you challenge a business leader or an entrepreneur who just says, charity is not part of my mission yet?
I would ask why, right? Is it a money thing? Is it a time thing? Is it a care thing? What's the motivation behind that? Let's say it's a money thing, right? So I look at when we started the Bates Foundation, really, which is about 8 years ago, we didn't give our money. We gave slots in the classes, which didn't cost us anything. Right, so we gave time, and so the biggest thing I think for most business owners is they feel disconnected from what they're actually giving, or they don't feel like they have the money to do it. And so what we did is we found something we know we can do, which we care about, and we embedded it into what we actually do. Now, the other benefit here to your business, and I think if I'm speaking to a business owner, I've got to try and get in the mind of a business owner. Why do they want to give in the first place? Yes, it feels great to do that, but now in their head, they're thinking P&L, profit loss, enterprise value, all this sort of stuff. If I can get in there and I can say, look, this is going to benefit your business. If I can explain how your team won't just turn up for a paycheck, but they're going to turn up with this fire inside them because they want to make an impact. And now you as a business owner stand for more than just making profit, right? If I can say to them, look, in 25 years, you're going to look back and you're going to have impacted this many lives versus this many lives, and it's barely going to, impact your business financially. In fact, it might even accelerate it because of the cultural impact that has on your team. So if I'm speaking to a business owner, I will meet them where they're at, and that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because after that trip, I've spoken to you quite a lot about, like, I just want the business to do better so that I can give more. And I know you keep saying that we can't just give more; it has to be done in the right ways. But when you're looking at it from a business point of view in a P&L, you just want to give, right? You just want like that box is going to the Bates Foundation. And so, what could you take, going back to that business side? What could you take from the Warrior Academy in terms of systems and growing that team to 50 plus? So many locations, to the Bates Foundation, looking forward into its next 3 to 5 years?
What can I take from the Warrior Academy to the Bates Foundation? Yeah, I mean, there are so many things that you go through when you build a business. Now we've got close to 100 staff around the world full time. You learn as a business owner how to deal with all of the potential HR issues, the operations, the processes, how to plan financially for things. All of these lessons just have a massive carryover, right? And so I think that, the beauty of that is you're not repeating the lessons. They literally just carry over. You're just building something which you can attach and plug into your business. Although what I'm noticing now is there's becoming more and more a separation between the Warrior Academy and the Bates Foundation. When we first started, the Warrior Academy was fueling everything in the Bates Foundation. It was almost like an extension of the Bates Foundation. Then we separated it into a completely separate charity, and now it's getting all these massive partnerships, patrons involved for different reasons, and so on. And so more and more, we're seeing this completely evolve as two completely separate entities. The Bates Foundation is just partnered with the Warrior Academy for the character and program.
So it's one of the partners.
Yeah. So partnership is we're now one of the partners, one of the many partners, we hope.
Okay, cool. And so one of those partners obviously would go into one of those 7 game changers.
Yeah, exactly that.
So what are the game changers?
So the game changers that we've basically looked at from what we can prioritize from what we've seen in the slums in Africa are, first of all, food. So, no one coming to class hungry. That was the big thing, right? The next thing was a holistic martial arts program, so a character development program. They need an identity and they need purpose. If a child doesn't have identity and purpose, they're more likely to make mistakes, even if you feed them. They're more likely to get into gangs, drugs, whatever it is, right? So they need those 2 things. The next thing is they need shoes on their feet. These kids are walking a lot every single day. The next thing is water quality. So one of the huge issues we've noticed is, they don't have access to enough water. They're not hydrated enough. A quick fix for that is electrolytes. So we've now got a partner doing electrolytes. One of the next things that we're looking at is period kits for girls. This is totally overlooked. Yeah. People don't realize it, right? They don't realize that you've got 9, 10-year-old girls getting their period for the first time, and they don't realize the impact that has on them. And so these kids, there's no education around it. So they don't know what to do when it happens. They don't know why they're bleeding. They don't know the reality of it. And so they feel shame, guilt, all these terrible feelings around it. They skip school. They stay at home. They use rubbish, litter, or even dung to basically, put down their pants to prevent the period. And, so what we're now doing is having an amazing partnership with a lady called Zareen, who's been doing this for years, and she is going to provide thousands of kits to the kids in the slums. So that's the next one. After that, it is education, so it's schooling. So if we can provide these 7 things, it's a complete game changer for the kids. And the way we see it is that ecosystem of problems within the slums, right? And so it's, a lot of this stuff is it's something you wouldn't realize unless you've been there and asked. It's just like, what? Well, why? Why is that? And even homelessness and making sure they've got a house, right? No kids lying on the streets. It's another massive game changer. So we're rehabilitating kids from the streets. So it's a collection of them all. And if you tick every single box, what I've realized, and speaking to our team and building this from the inside out, is that basically it's very hard then for kids to go astray. It's very hard for them to fall into a lot of the traps that they fall into because you cover every angle.
And I like what you're saying there about the product, right? You could literally pick that up and put it into the favelas of Brazil or the slums in India. Another thing you say in this book, as part of your 6 Ps, you cover preparation and persistence. How can we explain those 2 Ps in what the Bates Foundation is doing? Because those 2 are the ones that stood out so much to me, like to prepare, to launch a charity and to grow a charity, but also the persistence to keep going when it costs money and you can't necessarily see the impact straight away. How do we use those 2 words? How can you explain those 2 words as part of the charity?
Yeah, so preparing is key. Doing your due diligence is so key. We would interview 10 orphanages before we partner with one. The reality is, and I think this is the reality that puts a lot of people off charities, is corruption. Right? A lot of people say to me, "There's loads of money in Kenya. Why bother? Why doesn't the government just sort it out?" And I totally agree with that. There is a lot of money in a lot of these places, and that's part of the problem, right? Because of corruption. And so when we go in there and we go to the heart of these locations where they don't have any access to food, money, medicine, schooling, anything, in order to actually help these kids, we need to know that the money that we're raising is going directly to the children. So we do an awful lot of due diligence, a lot of interviewing. We then visit in person. We visit all of the locations. It takes a lot of time. And ultimately, we have this staged release. Even when we give out uniforms, if we've got 1,000 kids in an orphanage, we'll give 50 uniforms out. We'll wait 6 months and see if they're still there, because they could have sold them on. Right? And so the reality is we need to have this system in place that protects the donations that we raise to prevent corruption. And then we have instructors that come on board that we know and trust, who are separate to the school. So we never send money to the orphanage or to the centre or the school. We send it to a third party, and they get paid after we've seen evidence of them actually doing the work. Yeah. So we've eliminated corruption through preparation.
Yeah. And I must say, from being there, I couldn't believe the amount of people or adults from the slums who wanted to be involved. I remember asking them, why are you giving up your time when you could be making an extra few dollars a day to help these kids? And they just all say the same thing, which is they want that generation to have a better upbringing and future than they had. At Melon Mission, I spoke to a boy called Gideon, and he was, I think, about 13, 14, and he wanted to be a doctor. And Joyce, who's the daughter of the lady who started it, and she runs Melon Mission, she was like, we have to manage expectations, because whilst he is bright enough, the English level in Kenya is phenomenal. The handwriting is far better than mine. But the limiting factor is money and its opportunity. And so whilst Gideon is bright enough and driven enough and ambitious enough, who's going to pay for his college, his schooling, his medical school? And she was like, in reality, we're going to have to limit his expectations or manage his expectations, that he may work on a safari. He may work, collecting bottles to give to the recycling company to make money. That might be his reality because of where he comes from. But the devastation there is that he is so bright and so driven. And that's one of 4,000 plus kids we saw that week. And I think whenever I hear you talk or other people about what we can do as business owners, that's the kind of thing that I think we should be striving for, because we don't need money ourselves. It just becomes a tick box exercise or a way to see how good your year was. And in actual fact, like you say, the impact you can have on other people is a legacy, and it's what's going to bring you happiness. And there's really nice quotes by people like Albert Einstein, who says, "Do not aim to be a man of wealth, but a man of value." And so my question to you would be, if you're speaking now to a 7-figure business owner who's listening and doesn't see charity as part of their future long term, what story could you tell them from what we've seen in Kenya or you've seen in India or Nepal to just push them over the line and go, at least start thinking about your future charity mission?
I kind of see it a little bit like the ghost of Christmas future, guiding you through, this is the life you could have, or this is the life you could have. And I would sit down with that business owner, and the important thing is understanding where their mind is coming from, right? They don't see charity as part of what they're doing, but they probably they probably want to make an impact in the world, but they don't know what that looks like or how that's accessible. A 7-figure business owner will get asked for money all the time by loads of charities, right? Also, a 7-figure business owner who's maybe outsourced the majority of work, their business is mature, they might have stepped back from a lot of operations. The excitement and the creativity that got them to that stage to actually build in the first place may have started to go. And what I've noticed working with a lot of 7 or 8-figure business owners is they actually get bored. And so what I've realized is actually building a charity is an adventure. And we can take someone who has built an incredible business but is now bored on that adventure. And for me, what makes our charity different is this fusion of impact and adventure. We are making philanthropy fun. And so people join us and we'll go all the way to Africa together. They'll see the impact of their donation in person. It'll be emotional. It will be life-changing. They'll come back with a completely changed perception and this purpose energy. That is a gift from the kids to them. But the next thing we do is, while we're over there, we'll say to them, look, we don't want this to be your only view or image of Africa. We want to show you the beauty of this place, the nature, the wildlife. And so we'll take them on a safari down the road that exists, and we'll give back to the economy. And so that's just one example, right? Where someone who's a business owner and is on that fence about whether or not I should donate or be a part of a charity can actually say, I'm signing up to a life-changing adventure. And you'll meet other business owners. You'll accelerate your own business. You'll change and develop yourself as a person, but you'll have all these stories and memories. I think it's very hard for a 7 or 8-figure business owner to say no to that.
I completely agree. And that's something we actually haven't touched on, right? Especially in Kenya, because, the Bates Foundation's having an impact in almost all the continents. And one of the things we haven't spoken about is the challenge of the wildlife in Kenya. Right, we stayed in the middle of Nakuru National Park, and we were 5 or 10 minutes from a slum. And naively, I asked if I could go for a run, and they laughed at me. And the next day, we were driving to a slum, and within 5 or 10 minutes, we saw a lion, hyenas, and you don't realise, because I'm from a place where, and so are you, where foxes or a big deer might be the most dangerous thing you're going to see.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing this. We're talking about the very obvious logical problems that we can comprehend, but these kids are also having to deal with no shoes, walking for 2 hours to school with lions near them. And that's something that people can't comprehend as well, is it?
Yeah.
It's just crazy. There's another quote. I'm full of quotes today.
Go on,
this just feels like it's so rampant. So Marcus Aurelius said, waste no time arguing what a good man should be one. And I feel like this is what the conversation's about here, to be honest. How can you be a better person for society and for the world as a whole? And so I guess my question to you would be, the work that you've done so far with the Bates Foundation and impacting people, with the Warrior Academy as well, but just impact as a whole, how do you think it's affected you as a man, as a father, and as a leader?
When you speak to someone who's been through a lot, they've got this level of empathy, right? I think that focusing on impact has given me more empathy. It's given me tougher skin, but it's given me more empathy. if that makes sense. And it kind of feels like two different energies. But when you speak to someone who's been through a lot, they can relate to you, and they've got this kind of feeling of they know what you've been through to a degree. And I think that's what Focus on Impact gives. It gives you this chance to reflect on how difficult life can actually be. There is this gift of perspective, right, which just makes you so grateful for everything you've been through in your life. When you came back from Africa, what was the feeling you had in terms of, your own life and your perspective?
So when I was there, it was guilt. And then on the plane back, and when I got back, it was extreme ambition, a level of extreme. I wanted to compound, I guess. I wanted it to compound. So I felt excited, sure, but I wanted there to be a perception amongst others that there was a needle that could be moved. And so the first thing we did was jump on the call with the team and be like, look what we've just done.
Yeah.
Look what we're part of.
So if you bottle that up and sold that, right, that feeling, that energy to a 7-figure business owner,
Unreal.
That's like, there you go. That is purpose energy.
Yeah.
You want access to this? Then you go on this trip. And the really cool thing about that is a lot of people actually don't give to charity because they feel like it's not going to make an impact, right? Yeah. Even when I came back, people were saying to me, the problem's so big there, you'll never make a dent. Or Bono spent his whole lifetime trying to change Africa, you'll never change it. And I'm like, okay, but he didn't visit Star a rescue center and change that kid's life. He didn't visit Mela Mission and give that child a bowl of rice and beans so he's not hungry that day. Like, these things might seem small to us in the big picture, but you're literally affecting someone's day-to-day life. And so, it's very easy to have this imposter syndrome, like we can't make a dent. So the feeling, I would say, in terms of that, how the charity has changed me, has filled me with this feeling that I can make a dent. I can change someone's life. It doesn't need to be on a massive scale, even if I want it to be. It can just be on the small things that you do for someone who really desperately needs it. And so, if you look at the thumbprint on the Bates Foundation logo, the thumbprint and our slogan, which is, "We all leave a mark," is designed to teach people that they have this unique ability to impact the world for good. We do that as business owners. We want to influence business owners that they can do that too. We do that with our team at the Warrior Academy by showing our instructors, actually taking them there and showing them that when they turn up for work, they're making this global impact. We show that to our kids, more importantly, the students of the Warrior Academy, right? So they have these thumbprints on their uniforms so that they know by being a student, they're also covering the cost of a student abroad who's going through the same program in a developing country in a slum in Africa. And so one of the great things about that is I feel, to your point on that quote, that there is this feeling of legacy. I could die next year, and I think people would remember me by the fact that while I was growing a business, I was also trying to balance it with making an impact. But more importantly, I was trying to inspire other people to do the same. And the compounding effects of that is way bigger than I could just do on my own. So when I look at our students, I'm like, it's in 20 years, I'm going to see the impact of this. Imagine growing up. Did you have like an amazing mentor or something growing up, which you just idolized?
Yeah.
So a lot of our instructors did. They grew up with martial arts instructors, which they put on a pedestal, and they were, amazing, and they wanted to grow up and be just like them, right? My instructor was Michael Tucker, and I was, 6 years old, and I thought, wow, amazing. He's a black belt. He's got the best kicks. He's a, English champion multiple times. I wanted to be like him. Now, if you imagine that same instructor was visiting Africa and training thousands of kids in the slums, coming back telling you stories, coming back and saying, just as you are doing this program, we're now teaching 10,000 kids who don't even get food every day. We're feeding them, then we're teaching them every single day. The impact that would have on a young mind, you're planting this seed of black belt character, and you're teaching that young person that they can make an impact. And the beautiful thing about that is we're doing it in Dubai, a place where kids, by a birthright, are born with incredible opportunity. They're surrounded with abundance. And so I feel like if we want to make an impact in the slums of Kenya, one of the best things we can do long term is actually make an impact in Dubai. You want to help the kids in Kenya, train the kids in Dubai. What if these kids can grow up feeling this sense of empowerment that they can and should, perhaps even their responsibility, make a global impact? That's what drives me, and I think that we'll carry on even when I'm long gone.
So do you think someone should give up their Ferrari to help the charity? What's the balance? What's the balance there? You made the choice to not spend the money on something material and to go and have an impact and build a legacy. Someone who's in that same position right now, how do they make that choice?
I think it's individual, and I don't see anything wrong with a Ferrari. I haven't got one, but I know for a lot of people, it's their goal, it drives them. And I know for a lot of people, if they did it, they would say, well, it's going to encourage me to grow the business even more, which is fine, right? What I would say is they might be missing out. I wouldn't have this sense of guilt or shame, right? Do your thing. You want to buy the Ferrari, buy the Ferrari. But there's something way better out there, like that will fill your soul, your heart. You know, it will fill your years with just this incredible understanding that you exist for a reason way beyond making money, and it will change you as a human being. And it's actually very accessible, you know, if you can be around the right people. And so I would argue that tying an impact to your business will do way more for you and your business than the Ferrari would. Give you way more joy. And I remember for 1 year I wanted a Ferrari, right? So Dubai is very easy to rent. You can rent supercars very cheap. So every month I rented a supercar for a day. You might remember this. And I'd rent a Lamborghini 1 month, and I'd rent a Ferrari. I'd get in, sit in there, drive it for a bit. And I said to myself, look, before I buy one, because I thought that would be a good idea to buy one, I'll just rent it for a bit and see what it's like. And I realized, you know, several months into this, that I very quickly got used to just being in a supercar. And it was like, this is not that special to me. You know, for a lot of people, that is their dream, and I get it. But if you've done it a few times, and maybe that's your character, it kind of loses the magic. And I've been growing the Bates Foundation for 3 years. I'm constantly shocked every single week at the impact we're making, and the magic in the life-changing experiences that I've had on that journey has far surpassed, you know, jumping in and out of supercars.
I think there must be something in that, in terms of clarity or confidence of your own character. Because I think unless you're really, really into cars, normally something like a car or expensive things are a material thing for status. So to make a choice to go and spend this on other people, I think shows at least clarity, but confidence in your own character and what you want to be doing, because you don't care what someone sees you in a jet or in a car. Yeah. That you go, it's actually better to spend something there. Did you think that's a valid point?
Yeah, I think that comes... It comes with emotional maturity as well. Like a lot of people, I remember feeling this shift in me when I got into my 30s and had kids, and I remember suddenly just caring a lot less what people think, right? And so the things that might drive you in your 20s, they don't in your 30s with kids. And you know, it's one of those things. It's like, oh, the Lambo is cool till you can afford it, and it suddenly isn't cool anymore. You don't really look up to it and think, oh, I'd love to have that. And so your priorities completely shift. You know, I know for many years I've just plowed everything back into the business and everything into the charity, and it's filled my life with impact and adventure and stories and experiences. That's how I've chosen to live my life, right? If you look back at my 20s, they were just filled with adventures and experiences. That's what I prioritize. But I do think that there is this element of you know, this shift that people experience as they get older. They want to impress people less. And I think it's kind of sad to be in your 40s and still have this desire to really want to impress people and not have this grounded energy where you're just happy being who you are. And now you want experiences for you, and you want experiences for those that you look after.
Yeah. I think people that are in search of relevance, will never find it.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing they're looking for. They want to become relevant. They want people to go, you worked hard, that's what you got out of it. And I don't think you'll ever find it.
Yeah. I mean, they want to be rewarded for what they feel has been a difficult journey a lot of the time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I totally get that. But all I'm saying is you might be missing out. You probably are missing out.
Yeah. There's no judgment.
No. Drive the Ferrari. In fact, buy the Ferrari, right? Get so bored of it that after a year, you don't really feel like you want to get in the Ferrari. Then phone me. I'll take you on a life-changing adventure. I'll literally change the way you look at your life and the world you live in. You'll meet incredible people around the world, and you'll change thousands of lives. Your mind will be blown. You'll think about never buying a Ferrari ever again.
If you could write one sentence on the wall of every classroom, in every school, in the slum that we visited in Nairobi, what would it say?
Jeez. One sentence on the slum of the wall of every slum school. Courage earns confidence.
Why?
We constantly focus on confidence, but really if we focus on courage, everything changes. Everything is downstream from courage. What these kids need is an inspiring mentor who can show them that there is a way out, but it takes enormous courage. Courage isn't just jumping up and doing a sparring match. It's saying no to drugs. It's saying no to gangs. It's saying no to criminal activity. And then the other side is saying yes. It's replacing those with all the right habits, which are difficult and challenging. What a lot of these kids need is the courage to overcome adversity. And that is what these mentors give them, right? It's this strength of character, strength of mind, and this resilience. And I think that courage is infectious.
Totally.
You know, have you ever been in a room where, you know, people lack courage? I hate those environments. As soon as I go into a room where people lack courage or there's a scarcity mindset, it's almost like it breeds anxiety, right? And then suddenly you start feeling it too. You jump in your spreadsheets and think, oh God, I got to check all my expenses and I got to figure out what I'm going to do next. And, you know, this project I'm doing is going to fail. And, you know, and the complete opposite of that is courage. Ever been in a room and you're feeling a bit uncertain, then someone comes in and they're like, this is what we're going to do. Yeah. It's going to work. We're going to change lives. Let's go. Suddenly, you're filled with courage. And that whole energy is completely transformative. And so, you know, that's also the way I kind of see the Patreon program. We've got a group of courageous people. We've brought them all together. There is no scarcity mindset. And so we're taking this courageous people, this infectious energy of courage, and we're trying to solve the biggest problem out there, right? For a lot of these kids.
Yeah.
So yeah, courage earns confidence. You know, it's a mantra we share all over the world.
Okay, so same question. But if you could write one sentence on the boardroom wall of every company in the world, what would that sentence say?
Every boardroom. Okay, cool. That's a nice opportunity. I would say...
Can't say sign up here.
Can I put a QR code on there? Yeah. I would do something like, don't leave half the fulfillment your business could give you on the table. Just like that. And then, you know, I feel like they might ask some questions from that. It's enough to spark an interesting conversation, right? You know, or are you fulfilled? Just a question, because that one thing, I think, summarizes a lot of what we're doing. You can chase the revenue. You can grow your business to incredible heights. And it's an adventure doing that. I love doing that with our businesses, right? And you want to have a successful commercial enterprise. We're building businesses. But don't do it at the loss of potentially having more fulfillment. You interviewed Jason Greystone recently, right? Always free. That's his mantra, right? And what he teaches and what he probably spoke about in this podcast is very much the case of don't live a life that you know, don't build a life that you don't want. You know, and if you could step back and look at your future life, what would it include? How would you feel more fulfilled? And of course, money then provides people with all the opportunities, but there's a whole other element there of impact, which can just be completely transformative. So are you fulfilled? Or, you know, don't leave half of it on the table.
I really like that. And I also like what you said about all you've got to do is spark an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
Because that's so true with everything you're doing, right? When you're speaking to the kids in the slums, spark an interesting conversation. To the people who are helping, who are volunteering, to the patrons, to anyone who's part of the compounding effect of getting this message out there. If you can spark an interesting conversation, you're halfway there.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really important. And sort of finally, what message would you like to give to your three kids, you know, as they're growing up and they're seeing what is being done with the business, but also with your family and the impact you're having? What would you like them to say that their dad's role was in what he's doing now?
So I actually asked my son the other day, what does daddy do? And, you know, because I was just curious. Like, he has to go to school and explain stuff. So what does he do? And he told me that he went to school and he had to tell the teacher this and the kids this. And he said that daddy helps kids. And I love that. I thought that was great. That was his perspective, right? Like, that was in his mind. He's like, that's what he does. He didn't say martial arts because there's so many other things that we do within that, right? So for my kids, I want my kids to grow up in a house where growing the business is just as important as making an impact, right? And now the business is more independent and I've stepped back a bit and it's more commercially successful. I'm able to pour even more of my life into the charity side. So they've now got this real 50-50 mix of entrepreneurship with philanthropy, which I think is so unique. I don't know how many kids that get to grow up in that kind of environment. So I hope that my kids feel inspired that they can do something amazing in the world, that no matter how small they may feel, they can make a small impact, you know, on their day-to-day life. I would love them to grow up feeling that these are not two completely separate entities. And, so many people, especially the older generation, look at business as this kind of bad money-making thing. But can we change the way that people look at business as this thing that can fuel impact more? Can we change the way that, it's not just about the profit and loss and all this sort of stuff, that actually it's a reason for a business to exist? I'm not saying a full switch to social enterprise, but actually tying your business to a reason beyond just making money is massive. And I think that, my kids will likely grow up and start businesses because that's the environment, right? Like that's the environment they've grown up in, and it's more accessible nowadays than ever before. So realistically, that's what they're probably going to do. But now there's the option of actually growing a charity or being a part of one that already exists. So philanthropy is now an option. I don't think growing up, we grew up in the kind of same area, parents doing similar jobs. I never grew up thinking, charity or philanthropy could be an actual full-time thing. I hope that I've given them the perspective to seek more from life by giving more.
And do you think they'll be able to come to some of the areas where the Bates Foundation is helping? Are they able to see? How do you explain to them what's happening? Do they understand?
Yeah, so we get asked all the time by patrons, do you take your kids here? Would you take your kids here? I'd certainly take my kids to some places. There are some incredible orphanages and schools where the Kenyan culture is just incredible, right? You'll go to a location with 1,000 kids or 500 kids who are starving, going through really horrible situations at home, and are the happiest, smiliest people you've ever met. Hakuna Matata is the phrase we all know, right? And that it couldn't be more true. Like the Kenyans are just like that. And so I would love to take my kids there. They would experience it. They'd love it. Would I take them to other locations where we need armed security with assault rifles to guide just a group of adults? I wouldn't. My job is to keep my kids safe. So there are some places I would take them, some places I wouldn't. But while I haven't taken my kids directly to the slums in Africa, I have through stories. And so, kids are amazing because they're so simple, and they look at the small differences, right? And so I'm in Kenya, and all the kids in Kenya that I speak to, they just want to touch my hair, and they're like, "What is all this? Why is it straight? Why is it different to ours?" And a lot of you guys would have got jumped by about 20 kids for touching your hair, right? As soon as one touches the hand, they all want to touch it. And the first question, the funny thing about my kids is they were like, "Oh, why is the hair different?" That's how kids see it, right? It's only us as adults who then place something negative on the differences that we've all got around the world. And so I love that about kids. They ask those questions, and it kind of reminded me of when I was in Thailand. We were in a fairly poor area of Thailand. We were traveling through it, and my daughter was like, "Why do these kids not have?" They were playing with the kids. Why, the local kids? Why don't they have a roof? And I just said, "Look, these kids don't have a roof in the house." She's like, "Oh, okay." And then she looked to her right. She saw a hammock. She was like, "Oh, that's not fair. They've got a hammock." Right? It was like that was the thing she focused on. And I think we try and complicate things as adults, but kids are just kids all over the world. They just face very, very difficult challenges in some areas versus others. And so I take my kids to the slums already through stories, and they grew up in a house where they hear about these things all the time. I'm honest with the situation. They don't have enough food. They've got all these situations, but some of them get an opportunity to do martial arts just like you. They're doing the same program. They're going to school. They've got lots of friends. You know what I mean? So it's sharing those stories and being open and honest, but making it relevant for them so they get it.
Yeah. And the power of your kids being able to come on that journey, maybe not physically yet, but as part of the stories, means that they are going to be so worldly. They have such a worldly view, and hopefully that then helps them make a greater impact in their lives as well.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges parents in the UAE face, right? The reason parents in the UAE are here in the UAE is typically because they've worked really hard all their lives, got to a point where they've built success, and now they're financially successful or professionally successful. From working with thousands of families here and parents here, one thing I know is the biggest concern of parents is, how do I make sure my kids have that? Because ultimately the reason I have success now, or they might have success now, is because they went through so much hardship and struggle, and their kids are growing up without that. Their kids are growing up with abundance, with convenience everywhere, with huge opportunities they didn't have. How can you make sure your kids have the grit, the resilience, and the understanding and perspective and the gratitude for the small things in life? And I think for me as a dad, this is how I give that to my children while still giving them the life that they currently live in Dubai.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. If someone's listening to this and they want to become part of the Bates Foundation, how can they do it?
So just go to thebatesfoundation.com There are 3 options. You can join as a patron. It's invite only and you get interviewed, so you'll need a referral from one of the other patrons. We've only got 35 spaces and there's about 15 left. You can sponsor a community, so you can join the community, you can sponsor a class of 10 to 15 students for £25 a month, or you can partner with us. So one of the big things we've realized is that we don't need to have to raise money for every single one of those 7 game changers. So we have covered about 2 of those with partnerships. We've got 4 or 5 more that we're looking to secure. So if you listen to this and you've been inspired to work with us, you could be a patron, you can join the community, or you can actually partner with us to solve one of the game changers.
Perfect. I think it's amazing what you're doing, and thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to that episode. I hope you enjoyed it just as much as I enjoyed speaking to that guest. If you scroll down now, you will find a link to our Healthy Hustle newsletter. There's more than 10,000 people receiving the newsletter every week, and it helps break down how to become a top podcast guest. It will also break down exactly what this guest that you've just listened to did to create such a great episode that you've just listened to. I hope it's helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.